No, it's just one, right?
That's right.
Have one thing you might be able to do. Sometimes you can tell PowerPoint that it isn't a PowerPoint, and it's not, video. It realizes the clicker should work. I'm going to do this. It didn't work. Oh my! It worked yesterday. Yeah, they're very. Hey, did. I wouldn't trust it though. Not gonna lie. I'm gonna say I would benefit, or you probably benefit from just having a person click the slides free.
Okay.
But I'll leave it with you. You can try it.
Okay.
But I wouldn't trust it, unfortunately.
Okay.
We do what we can. How are you feeling? How's slide wise?
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, yeah. Do you guys have a preference on it to other one you can see?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why are they here?
Because it's just because it means I'm
Yeah. Is it still Google Monitors?
hello. Good to see you, Susan.
I put a picture of her in here. I know.
Yes.
That's good. Yeah, the clicker is convertible.
Yes,
Yeah, but yeah. All the clickers are. Have an act. I'll leave it to it.
All right, thank you. Have a great session. Yes, thank you.
That for your presentation.
Yes, there's a copy of my slides. If you follow the QR code, there's also a link, aub.ie/IWAC, which it is case sensitive. The IWAC are capital. But if you want to look at a copy of the slides later or something like that, that is available. Okay. Yeah, definitely. Maybe a few more will come in.
Good morning. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Lindsay Clark. I co-chair the AWAC mentoring committee with H. Kim's at Embry-Riddle. And one of our initiatives is virtual workshops we do for a year. And Catherine Brown is one of our speakers last fall. So we're sponsoring her presentation here as a follow-up study that she's done on LGBT inclusion affinity groups in her writing center. And so last fall, she presented this really innovative program, shared it with our workshop participants that she developed. And now that she's collected data from that experience, she is back and we're so excited to have her tell us more about this initiative. So I'm so happy to introduce Catherine Brown.
Thank you, and I really appreciate Lindsay's work for getting me here. So it's very exciting to be part of the AWAC conference. This is a really great experience for me. So as you see, there is a QR code on the slide. There's also a link where you can download a copy of my slides if you would like to look at those later. And if you have any trouble accessing those materials, please let me know and I can help you after the session. So let's go to the next slide. We have a lot to cover today. Thank you. Yeah, so a lot to cover today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what brought me to this project of affinity groups. We'll dive into affinity groups and we'll spend a lot of time exploring what's actually my dissertation study. The next slide. And the next slide again. Thank you. So my background is that I am an administrator at University Writing at Auburn University. I was a graduate assistant there for 2 years while working on my dissertation. And last July, I moved into the role of assistant director. Meanwhile, I have been working on my dissertation study, which is this project, which I will talk to you about a lot. Very excited to share about it. I came into my role of assistant director with about 10 years of experience teaching core composition and literature courses. Many of those I taught as an adjunct. Some of those I taught as a full-time instructor at a community college. So I've had a few career transitions. I went from the college teaching into a PhD program in English language arts education, which is secondary education. And then I started feeling like this wasn't quite the right fit for me. I was very interested in pedagogy, didn't see myself moving into secondary ed. And so I have transitioned again into Writing Center and WAC program administration work. So University Writing is a very large WAC program. We have a writing center as well and about 60 employees at Auburn University. My role is to support graduate student writers across disciplines. So I work with our team of 10 graduate assistants and prepare them to work with graduate writers across campus. So I want to share, this is an excerpt from my job application statement for the assistant director role. So it's very important to me to consider my own philosophy and my own positionality and how that shapes the work I do as an administrator. So this is a brief excerpt, which also shares some of my personal identities. So it says, as a white, queer writing program administrator, I maintain awareness of my identities to understand how they shape my work. Through a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I work to create a welcoming working and learning environment for staff and students with diverse backgrounds and identities. By fostering community building and critical conversations amongst our staff, I seek to develop spaces where our employees and students feel a sense of belonging and recognize that they are valued and appreciated. So I think that what I was trying to communicate here is that I am deeply interested in investing in the health of our staff. You know, we have a large staff, 60 people. And so I have been looking for ways to create a welcoming working space for, especially for our student workers who have many diverse and marginalized identities. So I have a number of programs that I've developed to do that work. Affinity groups are just one of those programs. So let's just take a brief look at some research on welcoming in writing centers, which informs this project. So much of that research has focused on creating a homey setting. You'll see literature about, sofas, coffee machines, the physical layout of the space of a writing center. And I think that's a really great emphasis. But I think that what we should be aware of is that that emphasis may be informed by a very American point of view, while we serve very diverse students. We have many international students who come to see us at our writing center. And I would say that when we talk about how to be welcoming, how to express welcoming in the literature, that's still informed through the lens of people with the most privileged identities. So white, upper middle class, college backgrounds. So we need to think more critically about what it means to be welcoming to a much more diverse set of workers and students. So my focus, as I mentioned, is on welcoming employees. I think that is a first step toward being able to create a space that can then be welcoming to a larger population of the university. So again, more research on LGBTQ identities in writing centers. It's very limited. It's a growing body of research, but when I started my position as a graduate assistant, I wanted to know, based on my queer identity, what is the climate in writing center studies for LGBTQ people, or people who share my identity? And so I was very surprised and a little uncomfortable or thrown off when I saw the huge gap in the literature. I started this research a few years ago, and there were maybe 20 pieces that made some mention of LGBTQ identities at the space of at least a paragraph. That's growing, that's changing, but there is still a huge gap, which leads me to a lot of questions. Why does this gap exist? Why has there not been attention to LGBTQ students? We know that identity is absolutely wrapped up in writing. And so the way we teach and talk about writing impacts the way students are validated in the way they write about their identities. So in the literature, there are people like Harry Denny. He's done a lot of work on this topic. He pointed out a curious silence in the literature. There's a really great piece I would encourage you to read in Praxis by Wren and Sloan, where they argue that writing center research demonstrates heteronormativity, and they analyze some of the language used in some publications in the field, showing really convincingly this is actually heteronormative in the way we're using language and talking about identities. So that piece was very influential for me. And I did a deep dive to see what are the peer consultant or student tutor narratives about their identities and experiences in writing centers. I found 3 narratives, and they were all stories of absolute trauma. I'm a big proponent of moving away from trauma-focused research. I mean, yes, we should expose the lived conditions, the social realities for people, but where are the stories of empowerment, of strength, that do more to move beyond positioning people with marginalized identities as other, as special problems that need addressing, and instead celebrate the strengths and insights that people with these identities bring. So I'm shifting the focus a little. Literature has focused on heteronormativity, but I am trying to expand that to focus on cis heteronormativity. So heteronormativity is the normalizing of straight identities and marginalization and othering of sexually diverse identities. However, cis heteronormativity also addresses gender. So cis heteronormativity normalizes cisgender and heterosexual identities and marginalizes diverse sexual identities and gender identities. So I'm trying to find a way to subvert and destabilize that a little bit. Yeah, it's a big project. Okay, so one thing I did was, I adopted the lens of queer world making, which gives me a way to think about what does it mean or look like to subvert cis heteronormativity. So queer world making scholars have identified some important things to consider while trying to create a habitable space for queer people. So subverting cis heteronormativity involves disrupting normative ways of thinking and existing, resisting normativity, destigmatizing queer identities, envisioning new possibilities. I love that part. So envisioning a world that is a more habitable, equitable space for queer people, creating queer cultures. So you'll see things like drag or pride parades. Those are queer cultures. I would say that affinity groups can be part of that as well, as I'll try to show. And also finding ways to separate queer people from the effects of discursive violence or violence based in language. So what I did was I created some affinity groups, which I am excited to talk to you about. So affinity groups are a paid and optional professional development opportunity. So we want to pay staff to come together around shared marginalized identities. These are discussion groups, which I formed. And so I wanted to focus during my pilot, I was piloting to see whether affinity groups would work. I wanted to focus on queer identities, LGBTQ identities. So that is leveraging my own positionality and thinking about how I can use my identity to hopefully create an opportunity to create a more inclusive, welcoming space. Affinity groups are often created in response to an observed injustice. If you look in the literature, you'll see a lot of groups formed around race in response to really difficult things happening on campuses or workplaces. I had a limited pilot to begin, and I'll tell you more about this later. It's gone really well. So I've expanded groups to focus on race as well and other identities. So the groups I formed in fall 2022, I offered the LGBTQ Alliance, which was open to people with LGBTQ identities. We had 7 participants. And so the idea here is that affinity groups create safe places to come together to discuss your identity-based experiences, to support each other, to develop coping mechanisms, and form a community within a climate that may be a little bit hostile. And then I also had the LGBTQ allies. So that was for people who consider themselves cisgender and heterosexual, but who wanted to learn about being allies to LGBTQ folks. So I had 12 participants, so about a third of my staff participated. And I was really excited to see that robust participation. We had 5 sessions in the semester. They met bi-weekly. And we had actually 3 groups, just based on scheduling needs. I had to split the allies into 2 groups, but we had still a really good size for robust conversation. So those were groups that built through conversation about identities toward a couple sessions focused on understanding allyship. And I think allyship is an important conversation for LGBTQ people and for people who are not LGBTQ, because we can all work on being strong allies and advocates to folks who may need some support. So I created the same curriculum for both groups. It wasn't very intense, right? So I had 5 sessions, each with a topic, and I had some materials I sent out in advance. So videos, readings, some materials that people could use to prepare for the sessions. And I created discussion questions to guide the sessions. However, I would say the sessions were pretty open-ended, so I wanted to follow the direction of conversations that arose. I really only needed my discussion questions to launch conversation, and then if things got off track, to pull the conversations back to our core central idea. So I'm going to talk a little more about each of these sessions. But one thing that I wanted to do in the very first session was work to create a brave space for vulnerable conversations. It's really difficult to talk about queer identities. There's a lot of potential for harm to take place, for things to be said that may not be understanding or supportive. So I began each affinity group by asking members to collaboratively create group agreements to guide discussion. The most important agreement was maintaining confidentiality. So something I didn't quite anticipate was that with the LGBTQ Alliance, I had people who signed up who were not out. So their identities were absolutely hidden. They didn't want anyone to know. They were comfortable letting members of the LGBTQ Alliance know, but they did not want that information spread to the rest of the staff. So I had to work really hard to think about how can I not only communicate to others in the group that this is a protected space. What we say here does not go outside. We don't share who's in this group. We don't share anything because this is a protected space. But I had to think about things like, where can I schedule a space for this where other members of the staff can't walk by and see who is in the group, right? So I booked a private classroom far away on campus. I used the BCC line and emails, been sending group emails with scheduling and sending calendar invitations. I had to find a way to make it anonymous. Signups were anonymous. I was the only person who could see it. I told my director and other staff members, I won't tell you who's in this group. So I was the only person who knew, along with other members of the group. So we emphasize in each group that conversations are confidential. Even in the allies group, we didn't want conversations to spread. We didn't want the potential for, oh, someone said something really insensitive to then be told to the rest of the staff. We also talked about listening to each other mindfully, with compassion, acknowledging to each other that conversations are vulnerable. And finally, the last agreement I think was in place to help protect me. So I led conversations in the allies groups, and I wanted members of the groups to realize that some of the questions they ask or the views they share can impact others, including the queer person in this space of people who don't share that identity. So I wanted them to think about how things might impact me as well. So session 1 focused on cis heteronormativity. I wanted to take a positive and affirming take. So I think that there's trauma for many people with a queer identity to have to listen to stories of suffering. Yes, you're allowed to share those. Those absolutely are a great source of conversation. But let's also think about what empowers us, what builds us up, where we find, our courage, our strength, our communities, our networks. So I wanted to ask, what are some positive messages you've encountered about gender identity and sexuality? Where do they come from, and how did they shape your thinking? And that was a great conversation question for both groups. People had a lot to share about their backgrounds, their families. Often they talked about growing up in very conservative religious households and maybe the first time they encountered different ideas. We had a question as well, describe a moment where you began to think differently about a cultural norm related to gender identity or sexuality. What resources or conversations influenced your thinking? Something I noticed throughout all the sessions is how much we talked about media. People were bringing up movies, TV shows, books, cartoons, just places where they saw LGBTQ identities represented as normal. So that wasn't a story about the difficulty or trauma of carrying this identity. It was a story of empowerment, or just this is just a regular part of life. Second session was on gender identity, which focused on expanding our understanding of gender as a spectrum rather than a binary. I asked people to reflect on and share if they were comfortable, how their experiences of gender might be complex, to think about how everyday language communicates the existence of a gender binary. We talked about pronouns quite a bit. I think an interesting activity can be asking people to just watch their conversation for an hour and count the number of gendered words they use. It can be pretty shocking. Think about practices to adopt to correctly describe others' gender. Third session was about sexuality, thinking about how sexuality impacts how you work, how you learn, how you write. Something I've noticed within conversations in WAC or in writing instruction is that people seem a little more willing to talk about pronouns and gender identity. They can see the connection to writing, but sometimes seeing the connection to sexuality can be a little harder for people to see. So I wanted to hear people's take on that. So I asked, what does sexuality have to do with working and supporting others in the Writing Center? What challenges do you face in speaking out to acknowledge and validate queer sexualities in your context? And then the most pivotal conversations were around allyship. So in session 4, I asked all the groups, what does allyship look and sound like? And so that question spurred so much conversation, and I ended up creating a collaborative document that I shared across groups. So I created it, no one's identities were on it, but I just recorded notes, just bullet points about what everyone thought allyship was. What did it demonstrate? How do you recognize it? What are the actions? And we'll talk more about what our group members identified. And so that conversation was so robust, I continued to talk about allyship in session 5. So I shared with each group the collaborative list of allyship, and we revisited, we edited, we added to it. And so it became a resource I was able to share after the groups concluded as well. So we also just reflected on learning and tried to create some program applications. So I want to turn to you all for a minute. I know we're a small group, but I have a few questions. As I talk about LGBTQ affinity groups, what is your reaction? Can you see yourself offering LGBTQ affinity groups at your institution? One question that I heard at AWAC was, why LGBTQ identities? Some people felt that it was too risky, and so they wouldn't even touch this topic. I do disagree with that stance. I'm in the Deep South. I am doing this. It's going great, I think. So who in your local context would benefit from affinity groups? Would you offer LGBTQ groups? And also, I just wanted to emphasize the importance of community. So I threw out a lot of questions. There's some on the slides, but I would just love to hear from anyone with thoughts at this point.
Well, let me get them to start the conversation. I attended this session to learn because I'm a member of 2 committees on our campus. The college, our college, and it is the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for our college, as well as the university WAC. We are formulating documents. And so these here are the LGBTQ plus. If that group did come as part of the diversity, and I didn't know much. I know they exist, but did not know anything. So for me, it is an opportunity to learn. And what we are doing, in fact, there were situations where it came up on the radar. Was one of our students had attended an activity in the community and was seen participating and identifying with the group. Another student saw her and ratted on the campus. That really affected our campus climate. So it was the person that was affected that actually told me that this is what happened. So she was forced to come out. And so I have been working and really educating myself about the group. one of the things that we as a committee to support the group, we are having the whole month of June as of here, and it is called Pride Month. We all, we have whatever you can do. Mine was the flag, but in a heart shape on my door. Others have it as a flag, you know, celebrating and showing the support to the group. And we have what is on display, the different colors, starting with, I think it is purple and then blue, you know, the rainbow colors. What each of them, I had no clue. I was learning that each of them means something. I didn't know. And so that is when I saw this. Oh, absolutely. I put it and said, okay, I'm coming here to learn so that I just wanted to let you all know that I am in support and I'm here to learn and be able to take it back to a campus. You can only imagine we meet every other Tuesday. I will be sharing this experience of this conference here with the group. So that's what I'm, the affinity group is the word. I'm a chemist by profession. So affinity, love. So affinity group, love for the group. And you have said something that members of the different categories in the affinity group, that all of them don't, they could be people who are supportive, that are not, they could not be in, they are not part of the LGBT. It's the same thing, the way I see it. We celebrated on in February, Black History Month. I was part of those organizing the panel. We had a panel discussion, 6 people. To the people's shock, I remember the resistance on the panel. What could you expect, members here? Black History Month panel. Everybody would have, if I take it just randomly, write down secret and pick it up. Who should be members of the panel? More than likely, which is what was on our campus. Everybody was expecting everybody to be Black. That's not how we saw it, personally. We have a white person on the panel. We have Asian on the panel. Of course, there were Blacks there. And with that diversity, I remember colleagues saying, Rosemary, we are celebrating Black History Month. I said, yeah. And she said specifically, and we're having a panel discussion on Black History Month. I said, yeah. And it's for Black History Month, right? I said, yeah, what do you mean? He said, I mean, members of the panel, I saw the list. I said, yeah. And didn't I see a white person there? An Asian there? I said, yeah. I said, we are talking diversity. Next thing, do you think we'll take the message to the rest of the community? Don't you think the message will be more effective coming from somebody that looks like that? We have a white, we have Asian. Oh, by the way, I'm from California North State University, okay? Our student population is about 85 to 90% Asian. Okay? So, and the Asian culture, they have their own thing. So, that Asian Asian being there. And the Asian man had hit some of the things, and coming from him, don't you think the student population will listen more than coming from all blacks? The white person taking this experience to say, hey, what you are hearing here is real. It had them, what they spoke from the heart. They said, the lady said, the white lady said, I haven't experienced this, but I'll tell you, I have seen it happen. So it is real. And people will. So it is so good. They never saw it. So I just wanted to share that with you. The affinity group would be very effective, even when members of the group, which you said, there were people there in the group that don't identify as LGBT plus. They need to be there.
Thank you for sharing. What I'm hearing you say is that, everybody, no matter their identity, needs to play a role in, addressing marginalization and creating, more equity. I will say it with affinity groups, I do recommend keeping a group for LGBTQ people and a group for allies separate. Because it can be very hard for someone with a marginalized identity to discuss their experiences with people outside that identity, with people who don't share it. So it was part of creating a safe space for LGBTQ folks to have the group separate. And something I'm continuing to think through is how do I then bring some of the learning of the groups back to everybody in the program. So that's something that is a continued question for me. So thank you for sharing. Yes, Susan.
When I read the description, I was imagining sort of the Writing Center sponsoring affinity groups for students more broadly. So it's a little different than I expected because I was thinking, well, how did you decide the Writing Center had that role, right? Like student org or something like that. So this is for your employees. So I think that's really cool. And you didn't encounter, did you even ask permission or did you just kind of say, I'm going to do this and didn't encounter any resistance?
There is no resistance.
There's no resistance. And now you've formed other affinity groups.
I have.
And they're all for employees. So
Yes.
it hasn't, have the students, have they been inspired to do anything on their own or is this, okay.
Yeah, I've got a couple of my graduate assistants who I'm mentoring through running their own groups.
Do you think you could do this from a straight identity?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think though, so I need to stay outside of groups where
You don't go to the group.
it depends.
Okay.
I went to the allies groups, but I think it would be much better for someone who's not queer to lead that group because it does take an emotional toll. There were times I had to intervene in problematic conversations, all sorts of stuff. But for instance, we have a Believing in BIPOC group, which is, I don't need to be there, right? I'm going to kill conversation. I just don't need to be part of that. So one of my GAs leads that group.
That's really interesting idea. But also giving them a chance to take a leadership role.
Yeah.
Have you done any assessment? Maybe that's later.
Mhm.
That part of your
Yep,
study?
that's
Okay.
the study.
Cool.
That's
Okay.
part 2. Yes. Yeah, and I saw a hand back here.
It's just like looking back to these questions and thinking in terms of like risks and challenges and also like community development. And I'm just, I don't know, I guess kind of like spitballing, like talking out loud because I know you're at Auburn, which is a very large university. And I'm at a regional campus that has like a mostly commuter population. So sort of like any community building on campus like is a challenge to begin with. And so this is just kind of like, it's gotten the wheels turning and sort of like, okay, almost like logistically, like how could I run something like this on a campus that is, already having like community building struggles? Because I feel like in one way there would be challenges like implementing it because of the community building struggles, but maybe this would also help to build community, for doing that. So do you have any thought on like based on how these have run, like, is this something that you think like could work on a Zoom setting instead of a physical location, or do you think like actually being in the same space was like a really generative part of it?
Yeah, I loved having people in the same space. We had with the allies groups, sometimes people would be traveling and say, oh, can I Zoom in? So then I would set up Zoom and we would do the high flex model. But for the most part, we do meet in person. Occasionally there's one person attending by Zoom, which I'm fine with. I think it maybe adds a little challenge. But what I loved, especially with the Alliance, was, we had collaborative furniture. We would just kind of sit down, put our feet up, people would bring snacks and just talk about our identity-based experiences. So I think there was something really valuable in that kind of level of sharing. The members of that group have suggested in the future, let's do crafts. Let's, have things we're doing while we're talking. Like let's do, pride focused crafts that we can use to decorate our workspace. And so I think that's an extra element of community. But also with community, you want to find supporters. You don't want to be like an island or totally isolated doing this. So, I mean, I'm with a really great staff, so everyone supported me. Supervisor, absolutely on board, absolutely supported me. And so that gave me a lot of feeling of safety while doing this. Yes.
So I feel generally people in this kind of community, as far as allies and with our identities are usually kind of on the same page about, confidentiality and things like that. But as far as you were saying, people not being out and things like that, so on kind of your first sessions, did you have them come together and kind of generate any kind of like contract, or maybe have them kind of, lay down any ground rules on your first meeting or anything like that, or were they kind of on the first page from the get-go? Or did you kind of, have a conversation about that on the first day about, how would that go as far as them being on the same page in that respect?
Yeah, so that was a first day conversation. I wrote down our set of group agreements and I reviewed them at the start of every session. I said, here are our agreements to shape our conversation. Do you want to revise these? Do you want to add to them? Or is this enough to help you feel, comfortable and safe and brave and supported in this space? So that was an ongoing conversation. It really was very easy. I would say things with the Alliance especially were very easy, because people came in to the first session nervous. How is this going to go? I'm very nervous about just what this will be like. I want my identity protected. So that was especially easy. I think I also went in as an administrator, so people, oh, yeah, they're going to agree with me with whatever I kind of say, which I was worried about that power dynamic too, of leading the groups as someone who also is an administrator. But there really wasn't any difficulty around that. I never heard about anything going outside the groups. We did assess, we did study how they went. So I think it worked as far as I know. Yeah, thank you. Yes. So let's talk about the study I did. I'm a little nervous to talk about this part because this is my dissertation study. I'm defending my dissertation in 10 days. So this is my practice run through. Yes. Very nerve-wracking. So I asked the research question, how do LGBTQ employees of a writing center in the Deep South experience welcoming discourses? So this is a little more broad than just studying the affinity groups. Yes, I studied affinity groups, but I also wanted to learn about our trainings, our professional developments, the conversations that happen week to week. So I wanted to study the experiences of both myself as a queer person in the space, but also I invited as participants any employees who identify as LGBTQ and consent to participate. So I had multiple sources of data, my own reflective writing. I had a couple rounds of interviews. So interview one just asked more broadly about LGBTQ inclusion in the workspace. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the inclusion of the workspace? Why did you choose that number? What does it mean to you? Can you tell me about a time you felt welcomed? Can you tell me about a time you felt unwelcomed? And then interview two was specifically just for members of the LGBTQ Alliance. So questions about the experiences within that group. And I also took affinity group field notes, which I was very careful to focus on my own experiences, to not be kind of taking advantage of the people in that space. They knew I was taking notes, they knew I was doing a study, but that I was only focused on myself and my own felt experience in the group and not observing what other people were doing or saying. So this is a post-structuralist feminist research study. So post-structural feminism is, I think, very in line with queer projects because we're questioning what has become normalized. So if things have become a normalized set way of doing things, of thinking about things, as a post-structural feminist, I want to go in and question that. Why do we always do science in this way? Why are manuscripts structured in this way? What might be missing? What are alternative ways of studying and representing data that may be helping me reveal new ways of thinking, new ways of being, help me write toward a better, more inclusive future. Through post-structural feminism, we very much focus on discourse. We see discourse as the way that power is reproduced and shared, and that through discourse, identities are kind of created, and that they carry a certain weight to them, right? The language I use shapes the way others experience discourses or others experience their identities. You hear a lot about breakdown-driven research within post-structural feminism. Sometimes it gets a bad rap because people say, oh, they're just trying to tear everything apart, which I don't think is true at all, right? I can still do queer world making, work toward imagining a better future. I'm just wondering, as I do this, where does language fail? And how does that create possibilities for transformation, for giving new meaning to old words that have caused harm? So I did an autoethnography, a certain kind of autoethnography. I love autoethnography. It's a study of self. It's a study of the effects of culture upon the self. So my own identity, my own experiences were very much part of this study. So it's very personal. My dissertation, it's been hard to share because it's so much personal writing about what I have experienced. And autoethnography, it's imagining a better future, writing toward a better future, and also thinking about, well, how can I disrupt normalizing scientific discourses? How can I move away from writing that loses the self, that loses the identity of the researcher behind it? I think that everything I write, that I think, that I study is all shaped by my own identity. So I want to make that really evident through the study. But I did a collaborative autoethnography, which gave me some additional data points, which let me do some feminist crystallization to have multiple ways of looking at and answering the question. So collaborative autoethnography is very much a focus on dialogue, even discourse, ways of talking about one's experience. So this gave me a way to tell a collective story, giving voice to experiences that may have been silenced, that are silenced in writing-centered research as well, because we're just not hearing about LGBTQ people's experiences in any kind of depth. And it's a queer world-making type of project. So as I mentioned, my theoretical frame was about discourse. I focused especially on how cis-heteronormative discourses have normalized cisgender and heterosexual identities and pathologized LGBTQ identities. So I have an example of a term up there that is, I don't even really want to say it, but it is a term that's often used to describe people's sexuality, but it's changing. I was shocked when I found out people are actually calling themselves homosexual now. They're trying to reclaim the word as an empowerment. So I think that's something my generation hasn't experienced. For me, when I hear that, I think about people hate me. However, just like queer, people are trying to reclaim that word. So that's an example of discourses evolving, changing, getting new meaning. And as they change, it changes people's social realities. It changes people's experiences of their identities and creates a more equitable future. So I tried to recruit a lot of people, but it's a vulnerable study. I had myself, as a cisgender queer person, and then I had a peer consultant agree to participate. And the peer consultant uses they, them pronouns, identifies as non-binary and queer. So I was a little disappointed about the number of participants I had, but I understand it's very vulnerable, very difficult to agree to participate in this. And I deeply appreciate Ray, which is a pseudonym that my participant chose. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little more about Ray's experiences than my own. Okay, so trustworthiness. I wanted to utilize or use, I'm not sure what's the better word, Carol, feminist reciprocity. So I wanted to be giving back to the workplace throughout, right? I don't want to just be a researcher coming in and writing about people, but I want to be building them up and contributing to their own well-being through the study. I'm going to move a little faster past the slide because we have lots more slides. For research ethics, I drew on ethical mindfulness, which is very much part of how I go about the world. I'm a yoga teacher. I practice mindfulness. So I wanted to be connected and attuned to my body throughout, and listen to signals or clues that maybe I was getting something wrong or going about things in a way I shouldn't. So we had as data my reflective journal entries, which also had field notes. We had 2 rounds of interview with Ray. Ray participated in the alliance. And I analyzed the data through writing with inquiry. I used in vivo coding and analytic memoing. So my findings. So through analyzing the data, I had 4 themes that emerged as discourses that could be experienced as welcoming, depending on how they come up. So those are visibility, mentorship, safety, and allyship, which I will talk a little bit more about in a moment. So visibility. So we are, through cis heteronormativity, you're silencing people's visibility, people's expression of their identities. It was very important to Ray to be visible in the space and to be recognized in their identities. So through talking about DEI and through talking about LGBTQ identities within our program broadly and within the Alliance, we found that there was increased LGBTQ visibility, which led to some opportunities for identity validation, but also some issues with inappropriate discussions and questions from some members of the staff. So Ray identified a contrast between their experiences in the South more broadly and in the Writing Center. So Ray said that in the South, in most contexts, my identity is kind of like seen and ignored, kind of like, oh, they're roommates, that sort of thing. So there's less fear of being like attacked for outwardly showing my feelings, but it's also that irritation of I'm not being seen for who I am. It gets frustrating, especially as an outwardly presenting queer person. So Ray was talking about the need for their identities to be seen, respected, acknowledged, and validated. And Ray found some of that validation in the Writing Center. Ray said that through bringing up LGBTQ topics, people came up to them to ask questions about queer diversity, which in many cases, Ray really welcomed those questions, but in some cases, Ray needed a break. It was too much. So it was a mixed bag of identity validation and invalidation. In the Writing Center, Ray really appreciated discussions about pronouns. On training day, we discussed pronouns. We share pronouns on the website and the scheduling software. And so Ray appreciated that. Ray described the pronoun conversations as very comforting. It helped. Ray said there were a couple of semesters where they were the only person who used they, them pronouns. So they really appreciated the normalization of pronouns that we were trying to create. But at the same time, Ray wasn't always very happy with the general professional development curriculum because it aimed to educate people about LGBTQ identities. And Ray just felt like this is not for me. So that's something I need to think about when contributing to the professional development curriculum for the whole staff, right? I shouldn't just be thinking about educating straight people. about gay identities or LGBTQ identities more broadly. I need to be considering the fact that we've got lots of LGBTQ people here. How can they learn and benefit and grow from these conversations and not feel invalidated or invisible in their identities? So I mentioned that with visibility, Ray really appreciated getting to kind of act as a leader, getting to share about their identities and have those seen and acknowledged. But Ray did say sometimes they felt like there were some people who seemed like bad actors. Ray got many, many questions about what are they then pronouns? How are they then pronouns used? And sometimes was really happy to educate others and sometimes would set a boundary and say, you know, I'm busy, I have to go, just Google it. And so for me as well, I wanted to be sure I set boundaries, as I mentioned, in the LGBTQ allies. And there were times where I had to redirect people within that group. And also just more broadly, I have seen student staff resist meaningful engagement with LGBTQ topics. So we had a reading, for instance, that the whole staff had to complete on it was by Alexiak. It was on slow peer review as a queer world making practice. And there were people who expressed a lot of resistance in a way that was really harmful for Ray. You know, so I have to think more about where do those conversations take place and how do I protect people with LGBTQ identities about those conversations. So mentorship came up as well. I was very surprised by that in the data. Ray defined mentorship as helping. It is not teaching, it is not advice giving, it is offering help. It is offering a shoulder to lean on. It is being that comfort, or maybe you didn't have it before. And so mentorship came up too, where I was asking questions about what is it like for me as an administrator to be in this space? You know, is that making things uncomfortable? Is that killing conversation? But Ray felt that actually it was important to have an administrator present and really benefited from the conversations we had about generational differences, change, improvement around LGBTQ inclusion over time. And so just in general, there's a lot of data here, but I felt that mentoring discourses involved imagining a more inclusive future, validating others' identity-based experiences, realigning conversation around shared values, because we had some missteps in the Alliance as well, inviting others to form a supportive network, and looking at generational change. So as I mentioned, Ray said that it was very important to see administration in this role, forming this group. It was comforting, made the workspace more comfortable. Ray said that this is the best work environment. That made it better. I was happy to hear that. It's not always perfect, right? There were some issues that Ray pointed out, but overall, I think Ray is feeling pretty happy there. I felt like I got a lot of benefits too, because I've always had a tough time validating my own fears about my own safety. You know, I felt like, oh, I'm just making this up. I'm just being dramatic. That's not true, right? Every member of the Alliance brought up their own concerns, their own experiences, and they really resonated with mine and validated my experiences. So I grew and was benefited as well. The Alliance spread, I would say. So Ray felt that they could be a mentor to other people who were afraid to join the Alliance, and Ray offered up conversation to other people, offered up mentorship. So I think Ray felt empowered by the group. Safety was another theme, and so safety was also a little tenuous. It's always uncertain for LGBTQ people. As educators, we should acknowledge the reality of that danger and give opportunities for LGBTQ people to come together to support each other. So I'm going to talk just for a moment about a disruptive force that Ray identified, and how the affinity group was kind of a contrast to that. So Ray had an experience where a consultant wrote a paper in support of traditional gender roles, and Ray described a toll on their mental health. Ray said, this took a lot of energy because of where I am in my mental health journey and my personal journey. So Ray managed that by saying it happened once, it's a separate event, it's not part of my work, but it was quite draining. We do have a staff policy in place to where we want our consultants to recuse themselves immediately if they feel uncomfortable or threatened or unsafe for any reason. But they don't often take us up on that. They're more likely just to try to power through, and I wish they wouldn't do that. But I respect Ray's decision. Ray said that they managed that consultation by just talking about grammar. They felt they couldn't discuss the client's ideas at all. So they just gave some grammar feedback and got through the session, and that was it. But Ray contrasted that experience with the affinity group. So outside the affinity group, but within the workplace, difficult things happen. But within the affinity group, it just felt much safer. Ray said, I can be more open and relaxed myself, and I haven't faced any judgment for it, for their identities. So the affinity group also increased Ray's sense of safety. I do want to read this quote because I was excited to see it in the data. Ray said the affinity group enabled me to be a lot more open and loud in every space that I'm in. I'm not going to make any effort to disguise this fact of their identities because I'm a lot more confident in myself, and I know that there are people in the spaces around me that will defend me if things come up. It's just confidence related to lack of fear, because I know that even if something does happen, even if I don't notice them immediately, even if I can't detect that there's other queer people in the space, that there are other great people in this space, and we are usually willing to help one another in this kind of situation. And seeing how many people join the ally groups as well makes me very confident in not fearing the spaces I'm in. So I was really happy to hear that Ray felt just a really strong increase in safety, but I noticed that contrast, right? There's a both and. So Ray's saying they feel very confident, but they're acknowledging something could happen. So that's always that risk present. So now we're at allyship, which I think was the most meaningful conversation that we had in the group. So conversations about allyship had a strong impact as well. I would describe allyship as an active orientation that includes extending friendship, listening to understand, validating identities, using inclusive language, asking LGBTQ people how to be of support, centering intersectionality, interrupting harmful conversations, and supporting the formation of LGBTQ communities. So Ray said that through talking about allyship in particular, they began to reevaluate people in their life who aren't queer. Ray said they were trying to see if they were actually portraying allyship in the way that we had defined, in the way that I need. Ray talked about their family being a really difficult part of their experience. And Ray said they were going to describe to their family the kind of treatment they deserve and ask for it and try to support their family in giving them that treatment. So we have an activity, we're very low on time, but let's move forward. So in my dissertation, I wrote a lot of poetry. It's a very post-structural feminist move. We do have a poem here I describe as collaborative because it does capture the conversations within the LGBTQ Alliance about what is allyship. So I'm just going to read it to you. I know it's really tiny. Allyship is action, not identity. Don't call yourself an ally. Leave that to someone who is LGBTQ. To be an ally, be a friend. Seek to understand us and apologize for your mistakes. Hear us and don't dismiss our identities and experiences. Support our community broadly. That means supporting all of our diverse and beautiful identities, not picking and choosing some to support. Use inclusive language and invite us to be open about our identities. Share your pronouns and create a safe space. Ask us, how can I offer support? Don't ask us, what are they, them pronouns? Develop the knowledge base on your own so you don't burden us with your questions. Be intersectional and learn about LGBTQ folks who are BIPOC, disabled, and from different economic and educational backgrounds. When talking with straight people, be an ally. Interrupt jokes even when no LGBTQ folks are around. Some of our language is in group. Don't co-opt our language. Set the tone for respect and celebration with your words and behavior. And if you can, bring communities of LGBTQ folks together. There's strength in connections and healing with others. So Ray did have a role in constructing this poem. I'm sorry, I'm going very quickly. But I think that this captured some of the conversations we had about allyship that were quite shaping for Ray's experiences. So I have an activity, and quite a few more slides. I think what we're going to do is, this is homework. You know, I suggest that you consider, how do you understand and experience LGBTQ allyship? You know, what does that look like or sound like? And maybe consider writing creatively, maybe a poem about what allyship is. You know, if you want to reach out to me later, let me know how that goes. But I think that poetry is a queered method that resists normativity, and it's one way to explore in a creative and authentic way what allyship looks like. So some recommendations. I would like to see writing centers offer affinity groups or affinity groups in other contexts. You know, I would love to meet with people on Zoom, share ideas, talk about what you're doing in your context. We should found our professional development in DEI. We should utilize brave space theories and set expectations for conversations. I also recommend doing a better job than I did in queering our professional development curriculum. Maybe you can start by imagining your entire audience is LGBTQ. So think about what they would benefit and learn from, and then use that for the whole staff. And then also think about how to engage with LGBTQ topics that prevent learners from expressing harmful sentiments. Maybe you want to have some reflective writing, or be really structured about how people respond to questions, and set the tone as well. Okay, so I want to turn it back to you all. I'm excited we're at this point. We have about 10 minutes. So my first question is, you know, how does the study findings or this project in general transfer from the Writing Center to WAC more broadly? I'm fairly new to WAC conversation, so I want to hear your ideas. What does this have to do with WAC? What could this teach us about working with faculty, writing course policies or assignments, designing curricula? How can WAC contribute to a more habitable world for LGBTQ folks through writing? So I would love to hear your ideas. This is the conundrum for me.
I will just add that the first one, it never occurred to me to have a discussion in the workshop I did, in fact, about the groups or anything else. So now I'm thinking, okay, but then I think, wait, I don't know. Where's the information? What should I use?
For your curriculum?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I chose just really openly available materials, you know, things that were really friendly for audiences. You know, TED Talks, things along those lines. There's a lot of great materials there, but I wanted things just to be very like open discussion. So those were optional. I didn't force people to watch anything or prepare anything. They could if they wanted. I just created a list of resources, which takes a little searching. Didn't take me too long. There's a lot of great stuff out there. I think the important thing is like the discussion questions, you know, getting people to think about their experiences and share things and kind of keep that lens of normalizing, celebrating identity.
Affinity groups. And yeah, so I mean, I just think that there's a fair amount of support. Well, probably not as much as there should be, but there's some support for students. I feel like there's less. And maybe graduate students, because a lot of them I mean, an undergrad in context like clubs and a lot of the things we have are adjacent, like our creative writing program, so like our, when you said poetry is queer, or think you're something like that, I was like, oh. Cause it's incidental, but space. But
About that too, because as part of a committee I was on, we had to get a sense of belonging initiatives, which is that, and I think it's the academic success center that sponsors affinity groups. So it's sponsored, but when I was looking at the list, it was like, we have a large amount of Hispanic students. There was a Hispanic group, there was a Pacific Islanders group, there was a transfer student group. So it was, and there was an LGBTQ group. But it was, didn't know anything about it. There wasn't any information posted, but now it's got me thinking, it's very visible. And I wonder how that might affect the participation and just curious around the logistics of things and how they run it. And if there are considerations of confidentiality, how they structure it, I don't know, but now it's got me sort of wondering, and then also thinking, there is nothing for faculty or staff that's simple, right? And
but we've had conversations with how housing is benefited on our campus. And again, you're like, it's very public, it's very open, so it's gonna be fine, if people are comfortable,
right,
it's not gonna be probably work for
it's kind of problematic.
right.
Yeah, and I wish I had done a better job when I gave the invitation of building in this language about the confidentiality and we're meeting in a private space. Yeah, kind of reassure people. Mhm.
I feel like the counseling, oh, I'm so sorry, go ahead. I just was gonna say, I feel like the counseling center is probably the most quick to, because they already have all the practices, right? They already do it, it's a very routine thing. Not to say like, oh, this is job for the council, but I just feel like they could advise on how to manage things where you're having outreach, but then you're also having practices.
It's a very small college, and that is very almost. I think I would be correct to say it's very homogeneous. Because it is homogeneous, the one person, that's all. It would be, and the culture, a big part of that culture is India. Is the, I think that's why those students, the student body that would have, that would identify as any member, a member of the student body that would identify as LGBTQ plus would not want to openly come out. I haven't seen, and I have my eyes on the ground and trying because of the antagonism from the base culture. Yeah, so, and the smallness doesn't even help.
No, we're being to make it harder, actually.
Oh my God, that's why I say it doesn't help. It's so, oh man, I can't even. So we, the faculty, we are trying so hard, like the committee here, to bring it, to tell in a visible way, to say, hey, this is real. Like I said, you walk into the main building of our college right now is on display, the flag and the meaning. Like I openly told you, I didn't know that each of those colors means something or identifies also. I didn't know that. So I am learning, and all that is trying in this collegiate environment to tell them to come out that they would be supported. But going back home, it's a big no-no.
And I wonder if, if you were trying to form, some sort of meeting for queer people, some kind of group, if it should even meet off campus. If campus is not a welcoming space, I wonder if there's a space in the community that is more welcoming. Yeah.
Because remember the story I told you? This one student had, and it was an off-campus thing. And another student, for whatever reason, maybe they live around or there's something, saw her, brought it back and ratted on her. I think it was an off-campus thing. Yeah, I think so.
So you would want to think a lot about, how you're communicating opportunities for LGBTQ people, how you're, trying to create some safety, whatever safety there can be, because the stakes can be high.
Yeah. I think now thinking back on our campus, one of the staff members has openly identified, and because the staff member is affiliated with the student government or the student group, probably they would feel safe to confide. Yeah, so that would be a good point. I think you're now just thinking a good point, a good starting point for our campus.
Yeah, if they're willing to do that work, because it is risky work and hard work for them to do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was gonna say, a friend of mine on Facebook, was on our campus, they're running a music camp right now for high school students. And she had an ally sticker on her door, and a student from that camp from high school came in and said, I'm really glad to see that on your door. So sometimes just having the signage and indicating a welcoming environment can be a signal to somebody who wants to have a personal conversation. Maybe not a formal group, but at least giving them opportunities to say there's friends.
Yeah.
Like I told you, on my door, the flag, mine is a heart.
Yeah.
I just put it on the door.
Maybe keep it up.
Something like that, people notice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you all for attending. If you want to talk after, I'm happy to talk. I know we've used our time. Yeah, if you have tips for my dissertation defense, I'm terrified. Let me know.
Y'all are gonna be very, very awesome.
Please give you a pass.
Yes.
I just want to graduate. I've been working on this for 6-7 years. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. And I don't know if I put it up there, but I did have my email on the slide. I'm really happy. That would be awesome. My email is okay. Good. Yeah.
I dropped the link to the slides in the chat.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
So, please reach out. Always happy to talk and share ideas.
Thank you. You're supposed to give the good news when it happens.
Thank you.